question is, what is Hoxhaism and what was its impact on U.S. parties? All right. Well, as those of you who watch this stream are aware, in 1961, the Soviet Union and China had a falling out. Oh, we got Dustin Schlesinger. Very good. The Soviet Union and China had a falling out. The Sino-Soviet split, very famous. Around the world, there were a bunch of new parties that were formed that were aligned with China. At the time that China and the Soviet Union had their falling out, Albania was the only country in the world to 100% side with China. Now, some countries were neutral. Cuba was neutral. North Korea was neutral. But Albania went 100% all in with China against the Soviet Union. They were pro-Mao. And because of that, the Soviet Union cut off its diplomatic relations with Albania, which is something they never did with Nazi Germany, which was a pretty nasty thing to do. They enforced an economic blockade on Albania. There was an attempted coup against the leader of Albania. The leader of Albania was Enver Hoxha. And so Albania was isolated as a result of that. So Albania was aligned with China, and China and Albania were allied. And Albania was a socialist country that aligned with Albania. And the main reason, let me just mention, the main reason that Albania aligned with China, which is worth pointing out, is because of Yugoslavia. Albania and Yugoslavia do not like each other. Originally, the hope was for Albania and Yugoslavia to be one country. And that was made very clear to Stalin by Enver Hoxha and the Albanians that they did not consider themselves to be Slavs. They did not want to be part of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was one country for all the Slavs. Albania insisted, we are not Slavs. We're not Serbs. We're not Croats. We're not Macedonians. We are a separate ethnicity. And so, Albania was a separate country. Now, in 1948, Tito, the leader of socialist Albania, he became the first communist leader to turn against the Soviet Union. He aligned with the United States. He denounced the Soviet Union. And that was a big blow. It was very, very much a blow to Stalin. And they denounced Stalin. They were accusing Stalin of all kinds of horrendous atrocities. The pro-Stalin leaders of the Yugoslav Communist Party were arrested. It was a big blow. Well, Albania hated Yugoslavia. So Albania made a point of really loving Stalin because Yugoslavia had turned against Stalin. Yugoslavia had betrayed Stalin. So Albania, they were all about Stalin. They loved Stalin. And in fact, Enver Hoxha published a book called With Stalin. It was about the 4 times he got to meet Stalin. It was just about his experiences. And in Albania, they emphasized that they were very loyal to Stalin. They loved Stalin, etc. So when Khrushchev came to power in 1956, Khrushchev denounced Stalin. Secret speech. He took a dump all over Stalin, denounced Stalin. Well, Albania, their whole thing was, we're loyal to Stalin. We love Stalin. And then Khrushchev started sucking up to Yugoslavia and trying to get Yugoslavia to get back friendly with the Soviet Union. Albania took great offense to this because not only was Yugoslavia their rival, their enemy, but on top of that, Yugoslavia had disrespected Stalin. So then Khrushchev attacks Stalin. And then on top of that, Khrushchev then goes and starts kissing up to Yugoslavia and saying, you guys were right about Stalin all along. Now be friendly to us, etc. So Albania took that very personally. That was seen as a very, very nasty dig at Albania. And based on that, Albania was very, very critical of Khrushchev. They didn't like Yugoslavia. They felt Yugoslavia was traitorous, had aligned with the imperialists. And so to see the Soviet Union trying to restore relations with Yugoslavia, that infuriated them. Then when they sided with China, they didn't try to restore relations with them. They had tried to have a military coup against them. They cut off diplomatic relations. So Albania was very much against the Soviet Union because of that. They aligned with China. Now they were aligned with China, and I believe there was a famous moment where Albania sent fruit to China, right? And it was like a really big deal for China. It was like the first time a country had sent them fruit or something like that. There was a moment where like fruit from Albania was like taken around China, and people were looking at the fruit, and it was like a beautiful moment. I forget the significance. There was some kind of significance, but Albania was aligned with China. So then, Mao is the leader of China. The Cultural Revolution happens. Albania kind of has their own Cultural Revolution, but it's a little bit different. In China, the Cultural Revolution was trying to purge society of anything that was not communist, right? And it had your Red Guards that were like going around enforcing the will of the party, trying to force society to adopt new communist ways, destroying any remnants of the past. In Albania, the Cultural Revolution was mainly about getting rid of religion, right? Religion was a problem in Albania because among Albanians, there is a very big percentage that are Muslim, and there's a very big percentage that are Christians. And for many years, Muslims and Christians in Albania have been fighting against each other. And the Communist Party, in order to stay in power, realized that they would have to bring the Christians and Muslims together. So they enforced a very strict, heavy-handed ban on all religion, and they destroyed all mosques. They destroyed all churches. They got rid of all Bibles. They got rid of all Qurans, and they had a full-on atheist state in Albania. Now, what's interesting is I understand that in some of the Muslim areas, they did enforce some of the Islamic traditions. Like they did force strict dress codes. Women couldn't be too scantily clad and things like that. But regardless, Albania, they were trying to be the most purely communist, the most in line with Stalin, and the most, they were trying to do that. When Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978 or 1976, right after Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping came to power. Albania did not approve of the market reforms, and they also didn't approve of China getting close to the United States. So Enver Hoxha wrote a book called Imperialism and the Revolution, which I used to have a copy of. I think I have a copy of it somewhere around here, but Imperialism and the Revolution by Enver Hoxha, in which they declared Mao Zedong thought to be a counter-revolutionary theory. And their reason was, they said Mao Zedong thought emphasizes the peasantry, it emphasizes the military, but not the workers. And they argued that Chinese communism was classless. It didn't focus on the working class versus the capitalist class. And they argued that China had never really been socialist, that it had never really had a workers' revolution. It had just kind of had a popular anti-imperialist revolution. And that Albania at that point declared that they were the only truly socialist country in the world. The Soviet Union had sold out. The rest of the countries had never really been socialist. China, their ally for a long time, had never really been socialist. So starting in about 1978, Albania declared that they were the only truly socialist country in the world. And at that point, Albania was economically isolated from the world, but they held on to the fact that Stalin had been good and they were good. And that was it. There had been socialism in the Soviet Union under Stalin, and then Khrushchev had ruined it. And now there was socialism in Albania, and that was it. And of course, there were a number of parties in the global communist movement that agreed with them. And they had been parties that had agreed with China. And as China was shifting to have the market reforms and the reform and opening up, there were a number of parties that had been pro-China parties that went along with Albania's criticism of China. And that is what people generally refer to as Hoxhaism, after the leader of socialist Albania, Enver Hoxha. They never called it Hoxhaism. They just called it Marxism-Leninism. And you're asking about Hoxhaism in America. Let me first add, most of these parties that were aligned with Albania, after 1993, Albania had its counter-revolution. Capitalism came back to Albania. Most of them backed away from Albanian foreign policy. Most of them said that Cuba is socialist, that North Korea is socialist. A lot of them haven't full on said that China is socialist, but most of them have kind of backed away from the foreign policy of Albania. They kind of realized that Albania's foreign policy, claiming they were the only socialist country in the world, that was a little bit nuts. Most of the parties in the world that followed Enver Hoxha, followed Albania, have changed their position. They've moved away from those positions. Oh, that's a good question. But Hoxhaism in the United States, there were a few groups, right? They weren't very big, but they existed. That took this position. The biggest one was called the Marxist-Leninist Party. That's what they were called, the Marxist-Leninist Party, and they had a bookstore, and they existed, and they had a reputation for being very strange. They had a daily newspaper that they published and they sold on the streets. However, this daily newspaper did not contain any articles that they wrote themselves. All the articles that they published were reprints from the Albanian and Chinese news. And it was a daily newspaper, but all the articles were like cut and paste from Albanian and Chinese news, which was a little bit strange. At the time, among leftists, everybody was into the whole counterculture, long hair, hippie thing, and they wore suits and ties, and that was a little strange. And I believe they were originally called They were called Kuzmal, the Center of United States Marxist-Leninists. They became the Marxist-Leninist Party, and now what's left of them still exists. It's called the United States Marxist-Leninist Organization, and they have people in Buffalo, New York, and in Chicago, and that's it. And I think they still have a website, USMLO, but I don't know. It hasn't been updated in a while. So I don't know if they're still doing stuff or not. I used to see them. You go to national anti-war rallies, there'd be 2 or 3 people from the United States Marxist-Leninist Organization. They're still there. Yeah. There's an article. Their website was last updated in 2020, so their website is still up. You can look at it, but their website hasn't been updated in the past 2 years. So, I don't think it's very active, but there was this group, the USMLO. And they were aligned with a guy named Hardiel Baines. And this is kind of interesting. One of the main ideological leaders of Hoxha, Albanian aligned communism, was a guy named Hardiel Baines. And Hardiel Baines, he was like a professor in Ireland. He was like a professor in Ireland, and then he moved to Canada. And in Canada, there's a very big party called the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada, or the Communist Party of Canada, Marxist-Leninist. And they exist, and they come out of the Albania tradition. In the United States, there was also something called the Rayo Light Group, Revolutionary Organization of Labor. And they very secretive. You would see them passing out their newsletter in the United States. I used to see them at anti-war rallies, and they have a newsletter, and they're very secretive. They didn't have a website or anything like that. They're on Wikipedia. You can read about them, the Revolutionary Organization of Labor. And then on top of that, there is something called the Party of Labor, the American Party of Labor, APL. That's like an internet party that was formed, in the last 10 or 15 years. And it's an internet party. It's an internet Stalin fan club. And they also like Albania. And that's Hoxhaism. Hoxhaism is an obscure, it's probably the most obscure brand of communism it's a very obscure brand. I will say that I enjoy, in my own tongue-in-cheek way, I enjoy the music of the Bainesites, of the Bainesites. There's a party in Britain, the Revolutionary Communist Party of Britain, Marxist-Leninist, the RCPBML. They recruited a very famous composer named Cornelius Cardew. And I could listen to Cardew music all day long, but I like it in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way. Cornelius Cardew music, it's an acquired taste. Okay. I enjoy it. I'm kind of laughing at myself while I enjoy it, because it's very, like they have one song, there is only one lie. There is only one truth. There is the lie of revisionism and opportunism of all hues, the lie of imperialism and reaction. And there is the truth of Marxism, Leninism, of revolution and socialism. And I listen to the Cardew music kind of ironically, because it's funny. It's very, very hokey. I don't know how to explain it, but I enjoy listening to it because it's fun. I kind of enjoy it. And in Canada, for a while, the communists of Canada, they had something called the Canadian Cultural Workers Association, which was their like choir that sang, different songs. They had a song, "Oh Albania, red star that burns bright, the world's illuminated by your light. Socialism is mankind's destiny, and we will fight for final victory." And I mean, it's just, you listen to it, yeah, Lily did sing it, and it's wild stuff, and I like it, but I'm kind of, it's fun. Like, I'm having fun. I'm kind of laughing at myself because it's cringe in its own way, right? It's like, come on, like, I mean, you're laughing at it, and you're laughing at the communism obsessed part of yourself, right? The only way you could like this kind of music is if you were like obsessed with communism. So yeah, I like it ironically, and yeah, I mean, so there's that. I mean, I don't know. From what I understand, the Kuzmol, when they were Kuzmol, the center of United States Marxist Leninists, they were notorious for getting into fistfights with other communists. That's what and that people called them, because they were based in Cleveland. They were started in Cleveland. They started out as the Cleveland Draft Resistors Union, and the Cleveland Draft Resistors Union. And it was this guy in Cleveland who didn't want to, go to fight in Vietnam. He was a draft resistor. He went to jail for it. He started the Cleveland Draft Resistors Union, and he started Kuzmol, right? And from what I understand, this guy, he was the leader of it or whatever. I don't know what his name was, but he was the leader of it. So people used to call this group the Cleveland Crazies. That's what they were called, because they were just very strange, and they wore suits and ties, and they would, do a lot of really long, complicated chants. They would like chant entire passages from the Red Book, and they would practice chanting them in unison, and they would get into fistfights with other communist groups. And, they were just a leftist group that was around in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I guess there's still a remnant of them. There's a website up that hasn't been updated since 2020, but there's a website, they're still around. They were the big Hoxhaist group. And then there's some people on the internet who call themselves the American Party of Labor. And there's some other groups. There's some like groups that do labor organizing and stuff, but it was never really a big current in the United States. It was just an obscure wing of communism. And I will say Enver Hoxha's writing is very interesting. I've read the Enver Hoxha books. Euro-Communism is Anti-Communism, with Stalin, Imperialism and the Revolution. And while I don't agree with a lot of Enver Hoxha's analysis, I find it very well thought out, and it is very interesting. So, on some level, I can appreciate that. One thing I will say is that I've talked to Albanians about Enver Hoxha, right? You always ask Albanians, what do you think of Enver Hoxha? And most of them living in America will tell you, oh, communism was awful, etc. But, occasionally I have met a few Albanians that have moderately positive things to say about Enver Hoxha. They say, people had jobs. The economy in Albania was better then, as I mean, I've heard moderately good things about Enver Hoxha before, from Albanians, but they're kind of the same thing you hear about every socialist country. Everyone had jobs back then. There was a lot less crime, just kind of standard things. And that I've heard that the collapse of communism in Albania was particularly chaotic. Like people were stealing the tanks and driving them around on the streets. That's how much chaos there was. Like, it was just one day the government just dissolved, right? I mean, it was particularly chaotic and crazy. And the economic toll on Albania has been devastating. So that's important to note. And I actually did, of all the books, I got a kick out of reading, now where is it? I guess I don't know where it is, but I got a kick out of reading the history of the Party of Labor of Albania, the official text history of the Albanian ruling party, the Party of Labor of Albania. They didn't call it the Communist Party; they called it the Party of Labor. And I got a kick out of reading it, because it was you learned the methods that the Albanian communists used in order to take power. Because when the Albanian Communist Party, when Albania was invaded by the Nazis in like, what was it, 1939, 1940, somewhere around there. The Communist Party of Albania was like 12 people. It was tiny. And the leader of the Communist Party of Albania, Enver Hoxha, he lived in Paris and he ran a tobacco shop. He was a tobacconist. He ran a smoke shop in Paris, and he was in exile. And the Communist Party of Albania was like less than 12 people, and it was nothing. But then the Nazis invaded. And then the Soviets started giving guns to the communists of Albania to organize like armed resistance to the Nazis. And one thing led to another. And when you read the history of the Party of Labor of Albania, what comes across is that they were always one step ahead, right? It was like, okay, the Nazis have invaded. All right, we're going to start armed resistance to the Nazis. And then the capitalists, the anti-communists, would form their own armed resistance group. And then they declared an independent government. And then the capitalists declared their own independent government. And they were always one step ahead in the struggle against the Nazis, right? And it was the struggle to defeat the Nazis that ultimately brought the Communist Party of Albania to power. And that they kind of were constantly maneuvering, how can we be one step ahead? When the struggle against fascism wants one thing, we're always one step ahead. And you see that the capitalists and the anti-communists were always like struggling to keep up with them. And that and that method, right? That was very important because in a lot of ways, that's the history in the labor movement, right? I mean, the communists were always one step ahead of the social democrats, of the reformists, of the, and that method of being one step ahead, right? And taking the struggle to another level and, polarizing society, right? And people wanted to resist the Nazi invaders, and the communists were like the most effective, and they were the most ahead of the game in fighting the Nazis. So they eventually became the new government, right? And the Soviet Union was giving them guns and weapons. The Soviet Union eventually recognized their alternative government that they formed and their democratic front, and that the communists, by being at the center of anti-Nazi resistance, were able to come to power. And I thought that was very compelling. And that there's a speech that Enver Hoxha gave, one of his last speeches, where he's telling his followers around the world that they need to be at the center of economic struggles. They need to be at the center of class struggle, because he says you'll never be able to out-propagate the capitalists. You'll never be able to win the argument, right? Because they'll always have more equipment. But if you can be at the center of economic struggles, I thought that was particularly amusing as well. I mean, there's stuff we can learn from it, but ultimately, I would say the main weakness of Enver Hoxha and Albania, the main weakness was the fact that they isolated themselves from the global communist movement. Albania really suffered. In the 1980s, Albania's economy was bad. It was awful because they didn't have anyone to trade with. They didn't have anyone to trade with, right? They had cut off the Soviet Union. They cut off China. They were just isolated. And one thing that I will say is that Albania was very much a case study in that problem of trying to build a totally egalitarian society in poverty. Because if you read what they were putting out in Albania during the 1980s, they were having food shortages. They were having problems because they were cut off from the world economy. However, despite all of that, they claimed they were entering the early stages of communism. They stopped selling bread, for example, right? They just gave bread away. Right? And bread was completely free. You could take as much as you wanted and no one paid for it. And they said, see, we're introducing communism one commodity at a time. Right now, bread is free. And maybe in a couple of years, we'll make milk free. And pretty soon everything will be free. And it doesn't work that way. That notion, when communism becomes detached from the ultimate goal, when the understanding stops being that the stateless, classless world is based on abundance, when it just becomes we're going to enforce egalitarianism in poverty, it's a disaster. Albania only had like 3 wages, right? It was famous for, there were only 3 different wages you could get. You could get wage number 1, or slightly higher was wage number 2, or even slightly more higher was wage number 3, right? That was amazing equality, right? Only 3 different pay scales in the whole country. You can't build equality based on poverty. It just leads to a problem, because inequality is rooted in scarcity, and poverty is what creates inequality. However, abundance is what breaks down inequality. And this is a very important point from Marx. And Albania fell into the same trap that China fell into during the Cultural Revolution, that Pol Pot fell into in Cambodia. You cannot build an egalitarian society in poverty. Next question. Have you seen the Empire Files about Ron DeSantis? No, I haven't. And I got to tell you, just throwing this out there, okay? I'm just throwing this out there, right? I have not watched it. I have no basis for contesting any of their information. I am not saying that anything that they say